Well, as we continue to commemorate and celebrate Women's Month, well, women continue to face challenges in the workplace. This, besides fighting for workers' rights, the question is, how can their voices be heard if they are not well represented in trade unions? Trade unions are historically seen as a patriarchal society with unequal power relations between men and women. Researchers have been posing questions about the role of women in labor unions, and to help us unpack the decision further, and as part of celebrating Women's Month, we're joined in studio by acting spokesperson for the National Union of Metal Workers Union of South Africa, Ms. Phakamile Hlubi-Majola. Well, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Right, you are known as a journalist by profession. Firstly, tell us about your struggle and how you landed in trade unionism.
Well, effectively, it was precisely in my work as a journalist. I've always been fascinated by the power of the working class and how the working class organizes itself, particularly in the stories that I was doing. I covered protest action, I covered Marikana, I used to cover service delivery protests. And ultimately, what fascinated me was how the working class, when they worked together, if they were united with a common vision, they were always able to achieve even impossible things. As a working journalist myself at that time, I found myself asking myself really deep questions about my own supposed power. You know, journalists are perceived to be extremely powerful individuals, and in many respects we are. We have the power to change governments, we have the power to topple ministers, we have the power to expose corruption, and yet my experience as a journalist, having worked in 3 different newsrooms, I found that as a journalist I was completely disempowered. So whilst I had the power to expose Jacob Zuma and other ministers for corruption, I did not have the power to speak openly and frankly about my own conditions, about my poor working conditions. And if I did that, I was victimized, I was brutalized, I was bullied. So that experience effectively was what drove me into the trade union space. I began organizing, particularly in my own workplace at that time, which was ENCA, and it was that journey that got me to where I am today.
At some workplaces, there are workers who are not allowed to form unions or even join them. What is your view, and why is this still happening in South Africa?
Well, it's happening because in South Africa, we have probably the worst labor relations in the world. The South African economy is based on the rampant exploitation and abuse of labor, but in particular of African labor. This has been the case since colonialism, up until apartheid, even now. When you look at the structure of the economy, when you look at who's benefiting in the economy, in South Africa it's a fact that we are the most unequal society, that a small minority of white people remain in control, remain in charge. They remain the wealthiest people in this country. By far, the African working class majority continues to languish in poverty and unemployment and inequality. They still suffer the same conditions that existed under apartheid. So what does that tell you? It tells you that our country has not transformed at all. Even though we celebrate the end of apartheid, the fact of the matter is, in a real sense, there's not been much progress. And so that's why these types of abuses keep taking place.
So are unions winning the battle for women at the workplace?
I think unions certainly have the power to win that battle and to improve conditions for working women. We have a lot of work to do, though, in recruiting women. Even the trade union that I work for, which is NUMSA, by far the majority of our members and the people who work at that union are men. And that's mostly because in the spaces which we organize in, the majority of the people who work there are men. But even when you look at our statistics, for example, Stats SA recently released statistics about working women. The working population of women exceeds the working population of men. So clearly we've got a lot of work to do as unions to make our organizations more appealing to women so that women join these structures and we can actually transform.
Concerning the numbers of women on the floor and voting power, you'll find that there are more women in unions than men. And when it comes to voting for the leadership, you find the majority of men at the front panel. Why is that happening?
Well, I wouldn't say that there's a majority of women in unions. That has not been my experience. Certainly that's not shown up in terms of the statistics. Many unions generally, especially in South Africa, remain very male-dominated. And this is part of what we have to deal with as unions. We've got to deal with and ask ourselves whether we have created an environment that makes the unions attractive to women so that women will join and will have greater participation of women. And of course, if that's the case, you can see more women being involved in leadership positions. What I can say, for example, with NUMSA is that whilst it is extremely male-dominated, the leadership is very progressive. They are one of the first, I don't know of any other union, certainly not in South Africa, that has been progressive enough to hire a female as its face and as its spokesperson. The assumption always was that women could not be as militant as men. So I think we've certainly made strides in undoing that misnomer, but we have a lot of work to do. We must recruit women into these spaces so that we can actively fight to transform the workplace and deal with patriarchy, which is a real problem in all our workplaces.
Well, what is hampering progress? Is it intransigency of the leadership, or is it the employer itself which is bringing about stagnation in as far as the transformation of the conditions of employment for women?
I think it's because the system you're dealing with is designed to exploit and abuse women, particularly African women. So if you look at, for example, our economic system that we are using, which is capitalism, capitalism has decided that they have to group people. And in order for them to exploit people, you've got to have a group of people who have less value. In this instance, it would be African women. So if you're talking about an ultimate solution to patriarchy, the ultimate solution is to defeat this capitalist system. The capitalist system is based on racism. It's based on inequality. It's based on exploitation. And once we defeat that system, we can fight towards genuine equality, where the work of a woman, even in a domestic environment, is at the same level as a man who's working at a CEO in a company. What capital does is it devalues what women bring to the working world so that they can constantly justify paying them less.
All right. Thank you very much for making time to speak to us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Phakamile Hlubi is acting spokesperson for NUMSA, speaking to us about the voice of women within trade unions, and bringing us to a break now. And when we come back, the show continues. Stay with us.